Good evening and welcome to the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name is Annie and I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn, which, if you're not familiar with us, is an independent bookstore based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first virtual event with us, welcome. If it's your seventh, welcome back. Thank you so much for continuing to support our events program in all the forms it's taken over the past few years. We truly cannot keep these author events going without your support. We are so excited to be hearing from the new novel, The Seaplane on Final Approach tonight, with author Rebecca Rukeyser in conversation with Asali Solomon. You're going to hear a little bit from the novel, and then Rebecca and Asali will have a conversation, and then we'll have time to take some questions if you have any at the end of the hour. Your questions should go in the comments or the live chat, depending on whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. You can ask those at any point during the broadcast. And then, speaking of the chat, you can also just say hi, let us know where you're watching from. And that is also where I will be putting links to Rebecca and Asali's books. So keep an eye on the chat throughout. And I will be doing a quick introduction of the speakers, and I'll be back at the end of the hour to take questions. So here we go. Rebecca Rukeyser is the recipient of the inaugural Berlin Senate Department of Culture grant for non-German literature. Her fiction has appeared in such publications as Ziziva, the Massachusetts Review, and Best American Non-Required Reading. She earned her MFA from Iowa Writers Workshop and has taught creative writing at Bard College Berlin and Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf. The granddaughter of Muriel Rukeyser and great-granddaughter of Robinson Jeffers, she's originally from California and has lived and worked in South Korea, Japan, Turkey, and China, and currently lives in Berlin with her husband. Rebecca, thanks for being here. And Asali Solomon's latest novel, The Days of Aphrodite, has been called a feat of engineering by the New York Times. She's also the author of Disgruntled and Get Down stories. Her previous novel, Disgruntled, was named a Best Book of the Year by the San Francisco Chronicle and the Denver Post. Her debut story collection, Get Down, earned her Arona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 honor, and was a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Her work has appeared in O, the Oprah Magazine, Vibe, Essence, The Parents Review Daily, McSweeney's, on NPR, and in several anthologies, including Best Short Stories of 2021, the O. Henry Prize Collection. Solomon teaches fiction writing and literature of the African diaspora at Haverford College. Asali, thank you so much for being here too. I'm so looking forward to hearing this conversation. First, we're going to hear a little reading from Rebecca, and then Asali will be back on screen to chat with her. Take it away, Rebecca.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to read a bit from the third chapter in this novel, and just a bit of setup. The novel takes place over several summers in the Kodiak Archipelago in Alaska, and the protagonist, Mira, is working at a lodge, but this is not the first time she had been in Alaska. So what I'm going to read to you sort of introduces the first time that she went to Alaska, and also introduces her idea, a certain preoccupation she has. I had been to the Kodiak Archipelago before. The previous year, I had been sent to spend the summer with my marvelous aunt. My aunt, when she explained where she lived, would make her hand into a map of Alaska. You make a fist and then stretch out your index finger and thumb. Your index finger becomes the Aleutian chain, fingertip west, stretching into the Bering Sea. Your thumb becomes the Alaskan Panhandle, thumb tip south, pointing towards Vancouver. Let me see, it's sort of like this. Yeah, it's like that. Where she lived was just below the second knuckle of the index finger on the island of Kodiak. I was sent to my aunt's cabin because it was thought that Alaska would correct me. My parents thought I was wayward because my grades were poor, and even though I was a junior in high school, I still had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I had no drive. But I hadn't really dabbled in delinquency. I had never gotten it quite right. I bought the wrong hoodie, etc. So I was being sent away from the yellow California summer for being dissolute when I had only committed the crime of being interested in the dissolute. I was focused almost wholly on the subject of sleaze. What was sleazy? I didn't quite know, but I studied everything for traces of it. Sleaze had something to do with sex, something to do with danger, but it also had something to do with other, more occluded aspects of adulthood. I couldn't define sleaze. I couldn't anticipate sleaze, but I could identify it. Places like dive bars exuded it, but it could also occur in sterile environments. Sometimes, even in Starbucks, there would be a man with a particular paunch that strained his shirt in a beguiling way, or a woman tottering in cork heels. Then, even the cranberries and the scones would twinkle with sleaze. I knew sleaze had something to do with excess, and because of that, I wanted very, very much of it. I approached the subject with a taxonomist dedication. I made lists of sleazy things and things that other people thought were sleazy but weren't, like cold weather as opposed to hot weather was sleazy because the streets were empty and there was more privacy. Cleavage was sexy but sleazy, but breasts were not themselves necessarily sleazy. Big rigs were sleazy, but so were four-door sedans. I made these lists when I should have been studying. I failed French. I was lost in a complicated maze of my own fashioning, almost 17, still biting my nails down to nubbins as I cataloged. The word sleaze doesn't come up often when you're teaching English as a foreign language. I've only had students ask for its definition a few times, usually because someone on some forum has called someone else a sleazebag or said, "Take it sleazy." When asked directly, I've made the elaborate shrug that communicates that I am not a dictionary. The definition can be looked up. But that's not exactly true. When I see students Googling, finding pictures of wide lapels and 5 o'clock shadow, I have the sensation of a drawstring being pulled closed. That's not all sleaze is. But I can't fully explain about sleaze. I can't write on the whiteboard. Fruit candy fed into female mouths and Christmas lights out of season are both sleazy. Sleaze can't exist without proximity to danger. People believe Florida is the sleaziest state, but they are wrong. It is Alaska.
Thank you so much for reading that. I mean, we could just talk about this for an hour. We could just catalog lists of sleazy versus not sleazy. I mean,
I'm
I
happy to
found
do that.
myself confused about the winter versus summer sleaze thing. I mean, the rationale for it is good, but I don't know. I'm still a little bit unconvinced. Maybe I need to go to Alaska.
It's not a watertight theory by any stretch of the imagination.
But it is fascinating. So I'm really happy to talk with you about the Seaplane on Final Approach. And so the first question I'm going to ask is a sort of basic opening question for a conversation like this, which is like, what is the kernel around which this book, developed? Like, what are some of the first images you saw from the book? How did it get started?
I mean, it got started really. I mean, there's a reason that that's the passage that I read, because it got started around the idea of a young woman who was driven towards something through a sort of process of like addled theorizing. Like, I really wanted someone who was like, all right, I'm on some sort of like taxonomy mission. I want to figure out what something is and what all it contains, and sort of go towards my future in that way. Part of this has to do with a summer I had mono, and I was just like, all right, it's impossible for me to read anything, except for some reason I delved into westerns, and I was reading western after western after western, and just being like, wow, okay, so once you read a western, you have an idea of sort of like the drive towards this particular violent white mythology, white American mythology. And it had to do something with a young man who has an idea that has to do with sort of like zeroing in on something, like zeroing in on an ideal of a lonely cowboy on a horse somewhere, right? And I was sort of started to see that as an idea of purity that was being chased, like pure lonesomeness, pure natural beauty. And that sort of dovetailed with the idea of sleaze, because I thought, okay, what isn't this sort of zeroed in approach to an ideal, like a pure ideal, something that was a little messier, a little murkier, and sleaze sort of came, like, bubbled up from the depths of the bog.
Although, I mean, she kind of creates the same kind of reverent relationship to sleaze that you're saying that these cowboys sort of think about with regard to whatever quest they're on, whatever, pure quest. But I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I think, like, even though it didn't occur to me, even though it's really obvious, this is like a sexual awakening coming of age story in a very distorted fashion, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting because, like, the idea, I like this idea of a kind of intellectual quest that just so happens to be like the quest everybody else is on at that age too.
Yeah.
But like she's thinking about this other thing. So are there other novels sort of like about young women or young men that that you're thinking of that this novel is sort of in conversation with?
I mean,
Aside from the westerns.
yeah, I mean, I think sort of to that, I think that goes back to what you were saying really aptly about the fact that she's on the same quest as everyone else, right? Like, it's this quest of like, I'm young, I got to figure something out. I'm going to like zero in on something. And also this is what titillates me. So I think, a variety of coming of age stories, or also stories about people that realize later that they were sort of stuck or ossified in a moment of time that had to do with that awakening. I mean, one of the ones that comes to mind is Brideshead Revisited, which I adore, right? And there's so much about that has to do with I'm in my mid 30s right now, and I am looking back with wistfulness and regret towards not like is it the best time of my life, or is it just a time of my life where I felt infinite possibility? That would be one other coming of age novels that I adore. I adore The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I adore Jamaica Kincaid's Annie John.
Mhm.
I adore. Let me think of that. Let me think of like, I'm just thinking of like these like, but these are all these like, perfect coming of age stories that never get precious with the idea of coming into oneself and show it as like, this is real messy. Like you're gonna be weird when this happens.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that's really interesting, and I hope I can ask this without spoilers, is like how many people seem to die in connection with 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 like sexual desire or the erotic in this? Like, I don't know, talk a little bit about how that works in the book.
Well, I mean, I suppose I was interested in, desire as a devastating force. I think that's interesting. I think that's a good a part of it, being powerful, right? It's desire is absolutely life affirming and also really messes stuff up. Right? I wanted to look at it in terms of its unwieldiness and its overpoweringness. And I think that had to do something with the setting, where I was interested in showing the sublime parts of Alaskan natural beauty, but also the danger. And I, that carried on over to people desiring and being swept away in the current of that.
I mean, I think also, and I do want to talk about place. I mean, one of the things that's interesting in the book is that the way that this particular Alaska is defined is by people who chose to go there. And so I also feel like there's something about, the people who choose to be there that is also related to like the violence and the extremity of it, right? Like those are the people who go and are like, oh, I'd like to be, I'd like to have this feeling. But it's funny when I was thinking about the sleaze and thinking about Mira's quest, and I thought about Audre Lorde, the theorist and the writer, right? So she has this essay called The Uses of the Erotic, which I always, especially when I was young, found especially confounding, And the first quote is, the erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. And I feel like the conception of sleaze in this book and the desire is like some warped version, because it's like this power, right, that animates, Mira and animates things, but not, it's, I don't think it's the bounty that maybe Audre Lorde was trying to describe.
Yeah. No, I be warped, absolutely. Like I want that part of this was to sort of like, part of the project was to take these ideas of desire, of nature, of a quest, of coming into one's own self in sort of like your late teens, early 20s, and skew it just a little bit. And I think that had something to do for me with the intensity and the singularity of this, like the idea of a quest or an idea of saying, okay, I'm going to figure out everything there is to know about this one idea of sleaze, if you're the protagonist of this novel or of anything, that there is something about dogged single-mindedness that lends itself to warping. And that was very much, I think, part of the larger conversation I wanted to have with this sort of troubling, this binge I had of reading troubling Westerns, because it's this like straight arrow towards terrible violence and evil done in the name of a singular idea. So that was,
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting for me about with regard to that is that when people talk about Westerns, they talk about them in terms of the higher ideals of our society. Like, when a man was, like good versus evil, like just all this, like as if they're actually offering some kind of important ethical system. But I think, so it's kind of interesting the way that you're talking about it, and it totally makes sense. So one of the things that, place obviously is a really big part of this, right? And it's this really, extended meditation on Alaska. But one of the other interesting things about the book is that in terms of the people who come to Lavender Island, it's very focused on where they're from, but it's almost as if like Virginia, Florida, and Norway are all countries. Like, can you just talk a little bit about like the way that you're using place to create these characters, or what ideas you were thinking about with regard to like, and then the Virginians came, and then the Florida,
I think the idea with that is that relates also to sort of my real world experience working in the hospitality industry, and working in hospitality specifically, where you're performing not only whatever role you're assigned, the guide, the cook, the baker, what have you, but you're also you're an ambassador of the place that you're showing people, right? So when people are visiting the lodge, all the employees at the lodge have to be like, all right, here's what we have about Alaska. Here's our Alaskan offerings. This is 110% Alaskan wild salmon. Alaska. And part of the idea that I had, and this was, taken from hospitality situations I had found myself in, with having groups from different places, was that I had noticed that the narrative of a place, the narrative of being a purveyor of tourism of a place, changes depending on who you're serving. So in the book, like for example, the Norwegians are coming in, and they're most interested not in sort of the natural beauty of Alaska, because Norway also is phenomenally northern and full of fjords, but they're interested in sort of the Americana there. And that changes, of course, with the Virginians, who are interested in sort of the natural beauty of Alaska, and don't need to be served sort of the idea of America on a silver platter.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, Mira sort of will say these people did, but I also like that there's a kind of showdown between Florida and Alaska, right? So one of the really interesting things about the way the book is crafted is that it tells us so little about Mira's life outside of these summers, and it sort of has these flash forward. So actually, can you talk a little bit about both of those things? So the way that it's almost like, the things that would have been most, if we were reading a biography of her, right? Like this would be like more like a footnote, but it's focused in on this. And then also talk a little bit about the flash forwards and why you decided to kind of, in some ways, because in some ways it seems really firmly narrated in the moment, but sort of move around in terms of that narrative time.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, there's a larger sort of frame narrative of a woman looking back, Mira looking back on this summer from the the 10 years in the future, 10 plus years in the future. And the question that's sort of being asked or answered is how did she come to have the life she does 10 years in the future? What were the events that led to this? And she's deeply peripatetic and is teaching English all over the place.
Actually, wait, can I just, because this was my question, right?
Yeah.
So it says half of all EFL teachers were adventurous, she said. The other half were broken. These were the losers, the floaters, the drunks, the people who got off on the petty power wielded at the head of a classroom, the people who couldn't get laid unless they fucked their students, and the people who found it impossible for one reason or another to return home. And I was going to ask you, which is she? What is she?
Oh, a nice little combination. I would say the finds it impossible for one reason or another to return home.
Yeah.
And part of that's an early passage. And why is she unable to return home? It's because she had this sort of idea of the way her life was going to be, this very, very set idea of how things are going to go, goes and gets this job, has this summer of experience, and then things go terribly wrong, and she's left adrift. And in terms of the flash forwards that sort of punctuate the book, and these are looking at sort of the other characters in the book and what happens to them. Those have to do with the Mira of the present, the Mira who's a teacher, negotiating with the Mira of the 18-year-old Mira. And so these flash forwards are, I mean, depending on which direction you're looking at, they're flashbacks or flash forwards, are looking at the other characters and seeing what Mira had anticipated happening to these characters, what does in fact happen to these characters, and how much what kind of a gulf, just because of time, because of the solipsism of youth, what the gulf is between what she anticipates and what actually happens to them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting about this also is that in terms of her quest, she has this idea, and Ed, the sort of object of affection, he's kind of like one of the least developed characters here, right? She just fills this vessel with this idea of him, right? And so it's kind of interesting, the idea that like she had this idea of life would be, even though on some level she must know, right, this is like a really elaborate fantasy, right? But the other question is, I mean, one of the things that happens early on involves this like terrible thing that happens with her aunt. Like, talk a little bit about like the fact that the way how she responds to that. Like, she responds like, "Oh, I'm gonna go back and go back into it." Like, I don't know. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I think that she has a deeply traumatic encounter with her aunt,
her marvelous aunt.
And in the wake of several things that happen, her idea is still like, I'm gonna go back to this archipelago where the aunt had lived, and I'm gonna make it my own. This is I am undeterred. I am doggedly going to continue on my quest to have this exact life. and I think that's part and parcel of this single-mindedness. Just, well, I have this idea of my life, and nothing can come between me and that idea. And I think in some ways, when you do that, when this character does this, there's a bit of self-soothing that's happening. No matter what happens, I have this idea of my future. I can make my future what I want it to be. If I do something over, if I take the steps that previously led to calamity, if I take them, but I take them in a different order. I take them, if I take them again, but I take them more slowly or quicker, then the bad thing won't happen. I find that something that I have in common with the character of like, if I can do it, if I can do something again, but do it right, then I not only have a sense of mastery over my future, but over my past, over whatever mistakes I may have made in the past.
So, who was your favorite character to write in this?
I think, well, the protagonist, because it is not just because I spent the most time in her head, but because I wanted a sort of complete first person that is where so much of the other characters are a way that she's navigating the world. Because I think that that's something that happens in your late teens or early 20s. I think that there can be people that mean something to you developmentally, and that's an interesting. I wanted to have a selfish young woman.
And so, what were some of the surprises you found in writing the book? Like things that maybe you hadn't imagined might develop, or
there were a lot of surprises.
what were some of the more dramatic ones for you?
I think the way everything turned out was actually a surprise. I had started writing this as in a hopelessly disorganized way. I had like 25 Word documents that had like novel 1, novel 2, novel question mark. And at one point I actually had to print them out and manually put them together in this like kind of hellish game of novel Tetris.
I'm very familiar with this.
And it was like a little maddening, but also a lot of fun. And I think that created a lot of surprises when I was putting it together in a variety of ways. I didn't know how completely linear things were going to be, or whether there would be these flash forward / flashbacks, or where the present of the novel would exist. And it was really through the Tetris game that all came together, and that was surprising.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the other things here is that talk a little bit about Alaska, talk a little bit about like what you were thinking about when you focused on it, and then what are some things maybe you learned about, your idea of Alaska as you wrote the novel.
Well, part of it started because I had worked seasonally in Alaska.
Yeah.
And I had worked as a commercial fisherman and in a cannery and at a truck stop and in hospitality. And if you're a young person in California and you want money to pay your way through the next year of college, for example, it's a great place to go. You can get room and board. Sometimes your flight is covered. And so I went there and, one of the first things was just sort of the physical reaction you have to somewhere that is that wild and has natural beauty of that scale. But also I was interested in what I saw as the mythology of Alaska and how that was being played out, at least in my limited like seasonal work experience. Back to the Westerns. It's a state that the state motto is the last frontier, right? That is baked in very much still to the sense of identity, which is what I noticed, and baked into the way Alaska sells itself to tourists. And so this was an experience of seeing people sort of in real time and participate in the tourist industry of selling an idea and a legend and a mythology. And I was fascinated by that and troubled by that, and remain fascinated and troubled to this day. Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me as, and when we were talking about it earlier and talking about the different states, also all the tourists are white. Like it's a not a lot of like people of color coming up because they want to be cold or like, hit halibut on the head with hammers or that kind of thing. So I feel like that's also part of like this shared mythology, at least the way it's represented in the book, between the people who run these places and like the tourists, right?
Yeah. For sure. I mean, it's selling this Western idea, right?
Yeah.
Which I now currently live in Germany, which is a place that has this deep-seated and interesting and troubling relationship itself with the idea of Westerns.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, that is catering towards Alaska framing itself as experience a real Western.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely catering to white Western European tourists.
And then the place on Lavender Island is a homestead, right? Which is kind of ironic. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Like the idea that this is a homestead where all this goes down.
So this really interested me when I learned about the longevity of the Homestead Act. So many things that I had understood it in terms of like Western lore and Western like Wild West history. On the one hand, so many of them are way shorter than I thought they were. Like I grew up hearing about the Pony Express, and I had thought that was like decades. I was like, okay, well, that was just the mail service for like, I don't know, the 1850s. It wasn't. It was like 14 or 15 months.
Oh my God. You've heard so much about it.
And it was a flash in the pan. And then was quickly like metabolized into Wild West shows. And the same thing is true of like other things that you hear so much about. And I just assumed must have gone on for decades and were really short. Homesteading, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of that. I had assumed that homesteads and homesteading were something that happened for a decade or so. And apparently, the Homestead Act was active in the state of Alaska through 1979. And that was sort of that kind of blew my mind, that this relic, this odd land grab relic, had survived and thrived in Alaska up until that point, and people were still getting parcels of land and under the Homestead Act, and being like, all right, I'm a homesteader. It's 1978. Here's my homestead. So again, like, troubled by Westerns, that was part of it.
So before we were talking about, I mean, one of the things, I was saying that's very striking to me about the book is the way it focuses on the things that these moments that Mira is sort of trying, I guess, in some way, in a narrative way, sifting through, and so we learn so much. We learn so little about her life back home, her parents, just the sort of broad strokes. But I'm wondering if the process of writing this has made you think about California as a sort of exotic landscape at all.
Totally. I mean, I live in Germany now. I've lived in Berlin for 6.5 years, and I didn't start this project, until after I moved to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that has to do with, I think, you grow up as a Californian, and you're not unaware of the fact that there's this buzziness and this mythology about California. But it didn't hit home really until I moved to Germany, and then found myself as put in a sort of ambassadorship role of California, especially because I'm not from the beach part. I'm from the, like, agricultural plateau into the gold panning part. Like, if people are, if a German is asking me about it, this is how I'm going to frame that. And that level of ambassadorship is weird. Like, I found myself in sort of a performance role that's not dissimilar to tourism.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what are some things you think Mira learns?
Well, that you can't necessarily have one idea for your life when you are and be the absolute perfect architect of that. Like, if you that sometimes things come between you and building an ideal life, that I think most profoundly, and I think this is the crux of coming of age stories in general. I think one good definition for coming of age is you realize that you're not the protagonist all the time, that you may in fact be a supporting character in someone else's story, and that you always are that. And I think that's part of the thing that happens in the novel is she realizes that the goings on at the lodge have very little to do with her, and I think that's a profound awakening.
I mean, it's interesting also because in terms of thinking about what happens with Stu, Polly, Aaron, again, no spoilers, but it's like she's almost like a ghost there, because that she could have been somehow implicated in that, right, more than she is, but she's also just like kind of watching this unspool, right? In these ways. But one of the other really interesting things about this book is that it's her experience, is almost entirely like intellectual and emotional. Like, she doesn't really get physically involved, like not really, in any way. So, I mean, how did you decide what was like the level of happening was going to happen with her?
I mean, I wanted a young woman voyeur. That was important. Like I wanted someone who was going to watch and intellectualize uh, to a large extent. And I think that has something to do with learning that you're in fact a supporting role in a drama that you may have thought you were the protagonist of. That had she been more involved with a certain amount of action, that kind of very deflating and very human realization would not be hers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's also interesting, like Stu and the aunt's husband and Ed, they're not compelling, charismatic. Like, there's something kind of interesting that all this energy is moving around these men, but they're just kind of like, was that kind of intentional or?
I certainly with the Ed character,
Yeah.
I wanted that to be, you can't be the architect of your own life,
Right.
but if you're going to be, embarking on a sexual fantasy about someone that you barely know, you do have a whole lot of agency in making up anything you want, right? And I think that there's a long tradition of like you project that, one projects that, characters project that onto partial ciphers, right?
Yeah, right.
Like you what you want is impossibility and some attraction, and then in order to be in the role of objectifying rather than being objectified, like you have to, you're sort of throwing the character traits in there, which is what she does.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was also interesting to me that Stu, I mean, I wasn't thinking at all, like I was completely blindsided by what happens, because I'm like, well, these are young women with their whole lives, like why would they sort of be interested in that,
I mean, part of it has to do with it's a small island. There's no one else there.
Right.
This is why small islands are fun, because there's literally no one there.
Fun to a point, right? Which is the whole idea here. What was important to you about the kind of like flash forwards about that are almost dreamlike, because we don't know how Mira is learning, but that show us the fates of some of these other characters?
I think that, I mean, they're dreamlike because she's doing a lot of imagining.
Yeah.
She's which is, back to the like intellectualizing and sitting in the corner watching. She's imagining a lot of the details of the fates of these characters. And depending on where she's imagining them from which point she's imagining that these fates happening, they have a lot to do with what is happening with her, what is happening with other characters, how she's relating the events that befall them to the events that transpired with her and her aunt in the previous summer. But yeah, I mean, just dreamlike because again, you can only imagine things so far, right? They can't crystallize completely.
I mean, I also felt like they were real. Like I felt like it was one of those things where that you can get away with in fiction, where you're like, this is a dream, but since it's all the reality we have,
Yeah.
because they had a different level of reality than, say, her conjectures about life with Ed. And Ed had no ending. Like, Ed just, evaporated, right? So, I don't know. I like those. I thought it was kind of interesting that, like, on the one hand, you're saying she's filling it in, but on the other hand, I was like, but I'm content that that's what happened to Aaron and Stu, like that kind of thing. So we have a question here.
Okay.
Should we answer the question?
Go for it. Beat me to it. We have a question from Jeff. Love the ending of your book, Rebecca. I was wondering if you could discuss how you decided to end the book the way you did, ending with reference back to the beginning. No spoilers.
Oh. Like the very end of the book. The very end of the book, I don't think this is a terrible spoiler, is sort of where the title comes from, and it's a final view of a character approaching in a seaplane. And part of that was just, this is a moment that's being replayed over and over. This is the beginning of the sexual obsession with Ed. This is the beginning of the events that are going to lead to the second summer. This is sort of the beginning of the end of the beginning of the dissolution of the relationship with between Mira and her aunt. And also I have been I've been in float planes a couple of times, and I find the landing process terrifying. There's this like sickening realization when you realize that's not a tarmac, that's a body of water. I'm headed towards it. And that seemed sort of resonant with the similar sickening feeling you feel when you're like, oh, I'm kind of messing things up. Like my life is headed in a certain direction, and it looks like it's headed down towards some water, which is also a theme of the book.
I mean, how did you settle on the title? I mean, it like the way you're saying it now seems obvious, but I'm assuming it wasn't obvious.
It wasn't. I went through a million titles. I was like, I'm going to name it the Homestead Act, and then someone was like, that's a really boring title. That's a very boring title. And also, there's also already a document called the Homestead Act. But I was thinking of just parts of the novel that I thought could act as a part that represented the whole, and that certainly coupled with my own memory of like the sickening lurch of being in a float plane that is heading towards a body of water. That's how that came about.
Thanks. All right. Last chance for questions, everybody. I also wanted to mention that there are links to books by both Rebecca and Asali in the chat. So if you want to head over to majorsandquinn.com and take a look at those, we thank you for your support. And this has been a lovely evening. This has been such a fascinating conversation. And I'm just so grateful that both of you were able to be here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks for your book, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for talking to me, and thanks for your books.
Oh, it's funny also, I was thinking there's a section where I guess it's like an Imagine Future Maureen, where she learns about how people make mistakes in New Jersey. And what was it? It was The Wire. It was basically The Wire and The Sopranos. It's kind of funny. And it's kind of like, oh, or Alaska. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
People make mistakes in Alaska.
All right. Looks like we have satisfied everyone's questions with Asali's excellent questions. So I will say once again, thank you so much for being here. This video stays available on the Majors and Quinn YouTube channel and Facebook page. So if you know anyone who missed it and wants to check it out, send them our way. And have a great rest of your evening, everyone out there.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.